Thank you very much. And hello, everybody. Right. It's great to be here. I've heard so many lectures in this room, RAI lectures, and edited the journal, and finally having a chance to talk as a speaker. It's a real privilege and pleasure, and also to see so many familiar and friendly faces in the audience. Now, having been here at the Staffordshire Hoard conference only a couple of weeks ago, obviously everyone knows I'm a complete and utter expert in hoards, and I'm also an expert in linear earthworks. No, this is not the topics that perhaps are most associated with me, and this is kind of a new and emerging area of my research interest that I want to share some ideas with you tonight. None of which are actually published, and perhaps some aren't publishable, but we shall see how it all goes, eh? So yes, Offa's Dyke and Watts Dyke, these great monuments, our, I think you could argue, first and third longest linear monuments from ancient times in the British landscape, have never been more apposite or significant in terms of their modern resonances as we, in the 21st century, reflect on borders and identities both within the island of Britain and beyond. And so, partly in that spirit, I've been involved in a research network established in 2017 amongst a range of scholars who are trying to create the framework from which we can do new work and new projects on Watts Dyke and Offa's Dyke, and broader discussions of the Anglo-Welsh borderlands and comparative work with other frontiers and borderlands, early medieval, older and younger, from different parts. And so we've called ourselves the Offa's Dyke Collaboratory, but you can use Research Network if you prefer. And we have started doing research and trying to develop new projects. And I'll try and share at the end some of the things we've been up to collectively. But tonight I want to really focus on a particular question I've been grappling with over the last few years. And as I said, this is quite fresh material and quite fresh thinking, and I'm sure I'm looking forward to feedback on it. But I do want to start off, before I embark, by a shout out to Dr. Rachel Swallow, who's in the audience tonight, who organised a conference at the University of Chester, was it 2016? 2016? 15, thank you Rachel, which was my first outing. That conference was on the Welsh March and trying to think in new ways about the historical evidence and the archaeological evidence for the long-term evolution of this borderland and its emergence as a frontier in the early Middle Ages. And this is really taking forward inspiration from that conference and Rachel's enthusiasm and support to try and think further about these monuments. So dykes are not usually considered hydraulic monuments. I think that's fair to say. If you walk along the Offa's Dyke path, those sections of it that coincide with the monument, you don't get the impression, in summertime at least, of a very wet landscape. You may get wind, you may get rain, and in the autumn and the spring and the winter it may be very soggy and muddy underfoot, but we don't think about it as a hydraulic monument. And indeed, any popular book about the early Middle Ages that dares to touch on these great linear monuments will show you an aerial view or a dramatic sweep across hillside shot, or as I am showing you here, a view of Offa's Dyke looking north as it rises up Garbett Hill, and here as it drops down a mile to the north from Llanver Hill and up to Springfield Farm in the Clun Forest. Just two views to give you a flavour of the standard way in which we experience or think about these monuments. And I'm going to try and remind us, or extend our thinking of these as watery monuments. Hydraulic, I mean here in the sense of not only the management and control of water, and no, I'm not going to come up with some crazy pseudo-archaeology that they're ancient canals. That's not what I mean, before we go any further. I just want to say that before you all start tweeting Howard's gone even madder. What I am suggesting, though, is that we need to get down from the hills and that sort of grand sweep of dryland perspective. We need to stop being landlocked and landlubbers when thinking about early medieval kingdoms and their use of linear earthworks. So the walking experience, a summer season upland view as a walker or a visitor gives you this kind of approach. And of course our earthwork survival is biased towards these uplands and away from water. You know, now it goes without saying that the watercourses move, but it's also important to say that these monuments don't survive well where they're close to key water sources. This is enshrined in the terminology we use. We talk about them as land divisions, earthworks, monuments, things that are very dry and earthy and stony perspectives on Offa's Dyke. In fact, there's increasing evidence, as Keith Ray and Ian Baptist's book shows, that these monuments would have had deliberate and careful uses of stone and natural geology, as well as earth moving associated with them, but they're still dry. We need to think about them as linked to land travel, sure, trade, communication, territory, conflict, power and authority. All of the key ideas that are included in Keith Ray and Ian Baptist's 2016 book, but we need to think further, I feel, about their watery associations. And we need to particularly address the fact there's been no consistent research focus on how these linear earthworks adapt and transform water courses in our ways of interpreting these monuments. So I'm not going to be able to give you a single reveal all of what these monuments were built for, when and how, and what they did, but I am going to suggest some new ways in which they may have operated in the landscape. So Keith Ray, spinning off from his book, on our Offa's Dyke Collaboratory website, does suggest, as if there's only 100 research questions we could develop for Offa's Dyke going forward. But it's interesting to note, and this isn't a personal criticism of his research, but it reflects our broader bias, that only 4 of those questions of the 100, that we might address relate to water. And yet factoring in the hydraulics of dykes might allow us to go further into thinking about their functions and significance. And this applies too to Watts Dyke and thinking about these 2 linear earthworks in comparative terms. Just for your interest, if you want to, you can look at it on our website, but these are the 4 questions he addresses. How did the dyke approach and relate to major rivers? Why does the dyke approach more minor river valleys in various ways? How does the dyke negotiate immediate crossings of minor rivers? And are there any other landscape features related to the dyke, including river ports and other land-based features? So they're the only questions he can come up with, written 2 years ago, that have a watery element to them. But I would suggest we need to think much further about this. And for context, it's important to remember that early medieval kingdoms in the 7th to 9th centuries, the Middle Anglo-Saxon period as it's traditionally known in this country, or we can talk about early medieval period more broadly, there were already precedents for expecting major earth-moving endeavours linked to water. So we know that in 793, a failed effort, admittedly, Charlemagne attempts a project to build a 30-metre wide Karlsgraben linking the Rhine and the Danube. John Blair talks about the archaeological evidence of canal building in the Middle Anglo-Saxon kingdom, possibly as early as the 8th century. And we know that canals are being built later, from the late 10th through to the 13th century across Europe. So the idea that these linear earthworks could have a water-related dimension is not fantasy or outrageous. It has a precedent. And we can also look to Scandinavia for precedents too. I'm not saying that these ideas are coming from Scandinavia, but we now have evidence that the Karnhaver Canal was being built in the early 8th century across a narrow island between Jutland and Funen and Zealand, in that middle of the Kattegat area of. So we see major engineering works going on in different parts of North and Northwestern Europe at this time. And another precedent for thinking about a watery dimension to Offa's and Watts Dyke, despite them looking very upland and wild and away from water, is of course the Dannewerke. traditionally, as in up to 2 years ago, seen as dating from the 5th to the 12th century, a multi-phase earthwork. I'll show you that we do have now new dates coming out for the earliest phase, going back to the 2nd century AD, but notwithstanding that, a multi-phase earthwork that is controlling land routes up and down the Jutland Peninsula that becomes associated with the early sort of proto-urban centre at Hedeby, or Hydabu, but is obviously not simply about land control of trade and army movements, but is also about water links, and the bit where the earthwork is only part of a frontier and a communication network linking the North Sea with the Baltic. So the Schlei Fjord and the Treen and Ida rivers. So we have this as a monument that has landward and maritime significance for trade, control of movement of all manner of kinds. And the forthcoming article by Trümmerscheit and Witte, a collaborative Dano-German work, has been able to redate the Dannewerk as early as the 2nd century AD, as well as refine the chronology of the evolution of this monument over time. But for our purposes, I simply wanted to flag up that this monument is a maritime, a watery monument. It's linking water routes and water bodies of water and rivers, lakes, fjords, as well as being about land, controlling land movement. And just to remind us all, there are also an extensive evidence from the Roman Iron Age through to the Viking Age of Scandinavian river inlets and fjord barriers in different forms, from palisades, networks of sticks, poles, sort of creating a minefield to control riverine transport and fjord transport, and also sunken ships, as a more, the famous Skudler finds here from the Viking Age. So we know that control of watercourses for all manner of functions was a key element of early medieval landscapes and seascapes. And to bring us to this island, Blair's 2007 map showing the navigable rivers, and obviously thinking about this western area, the significance of the Severn and the Dee on a much smaller scale. And this territory here was a key aspect of water and land communications. Now, in a very direct way, my inspiration to thinking in hydraulic terms about Offa's comes from the drought of last year, because here we have an 18th century ornamental lake in the gardens of the estate of Chirk Castle, a National Trust property, where Offa's Dyke here has been submerged since this lake's creation in the 18th century. And because of the drought, the dyke emerged like a terrifying leviathan from the lake for the first time in living memory. So you could wade across that in wellies in a normal summer, but it's never actually been revealed. And this just got my brain thinking about the sections of Offa's Dyke and Watts Dyke that don't survive very well because they have been washed away by watercourses, and yet those elements may have been very important. This is the one I know best, a much smaller river, the Clywedog, and yet we have a very striking survival on the Clywedog, just west of Wrexham, of Offa's Dyke, as its bank and its ditch survive because it has diverted its stream coming down the side of the steep valley. So Offa's Dyke has gradually grown over 1,000 years rather than shrunken because of the line of the stream defining its ditch. And when it crosses over the base of the river, valley, it still survives as a very prominent earthwork. So this is Offa's Dyke crossing and blocking the Clywedog River just west of Wrexham at Bersham, at Plas Power. So my point here is that having been a regular visitor to this landscape, it made me think much more about how the dyke is operating in relation to water. And there are other fascinating instances that maybe have potential for paleoenvironmental investigation, such as this location at Bronigarth, where there's been a pool, seasonal pooling of water ever since the creation of this monument, presumably in the late 8th century, but maybe not, behind the dyke where it cuts across a narrow little combe. So that's ponding of water that's only been ponding, or would only pond there once you built a linear earthwork to its east. So, and here a ditch, the ditch of Offansdyke at Bronigarth, where it still survives, filled with water in a winter season. So we have to think about the ditches perhaps watery and not dry in some places. And to remind you of associations with water, a view of Offansdyke from an iconic location, that's Tintern Abbey and the Wye Valley, where the Offansdyke looks over the Wye Valley, to remind you that it sometimes crosses over major valleys. This is the Clun looking eastwards from Offansdyke, and the river in the valley. So let's explore on map, in basic map terms, how this monument behaves in relation to rivers. And there are, to start off with, a few examples, and this was raised by Keith Ray in his book with Ian Bacty, the possibility that Offansdyke very carefully blocks some valleys. And here, of the Team and the Lug, it not only blocks the valley, but may have actually diverted or been partially involved in the diversion and management of rivers. So here, you can see the various confluences of small streams with the Team and the Lug at a point that Offansdyke now crosses at a point of confluence between these two rivers. And the question is, for geomorphology and for archaeology, was that the way it was before the dike, or was the confluence actually originally down here, but was diverted during the construction of the dike across the valley floor? And we don't know at this stage, but Keith Ray does make the point that the river naturally now flows in a very straight line alongside and in the ditch of what was now visible, but what was the ditch of Offansdyke to a point where the river confluence is now. So we may have examples here, hints, even in places where the dike is poorly preserved, where the dike's position may have been associated with blocking the valley, but also carefully placed so that multiple streams converge just to its west. And this is a point that Hill and Worthington's work on Offansdyke also reveals. So there's an a priori case to be made that Offansdyke and Wattsdyke are not simply landlocked, land-obsessed monuments concerned with the control of land movement. There may be a hydraulic dimension to them. The big scale we can address first. These monuments take us from sea to sea. Whether we follow Asser's account in his biography of Alfred the Great as suggesting that Offansdyke actually went as a continuous earthwork from sea to sea, or it was part of a complex frontier that was evolving and developing but never went to the sea, isn't really my point. At least where we have it going, it is controlling landscape from the Severn estuary to the Dee estuary in general terms. Although I would give you a hint of ongoing work. We have found it as a collective, Keith Ray, Paul Belford, my doctoral student Liam Delaney and I have found Offansdyke in places where it's not actually established and confirmed. So we do think we've got new bits of dyke, and the same goes for Wattsdyke too. I'll mention that later. So as a starting point, this is about long-term surveillance and defence, linking maritime and riverine routes. And Tim Mayling's map, you can't really see it very well, it's very garishly coloured, but it does make the point that if we map on the old Roman roads, on the major river courses, this is about controlling a landscape zone, perhaps supported by beacons, barriers, canals, forts, that is about managing both a riverine and a maritime landscape as well as a landward one. And using Stuart Brooks useful is perhaps overly simplistic for the sake of his argument. Contrast between an 8th, 9th century Mercian frontier with a borderland in front, refuges behind, and a linear earthwork, compared with perhaps a burgle system of the West Saxons later. Here he's thinking of Wansdyke really, but we could apply it to the Mercian frontier. At least this articulates the point in basic terms that we are looking at not simply a line in the landscape, but a desire to control a broader landscape sweep. And this is very clear at the southern end of Offa's Dyke, parts of the monument that were discounted by Helen Worthington as key parts of the landscape, but if there's one key lesson to come out of Ray and Baptie's book, I feel, it is the reinstitution of this stretch as a very convincing part of the same kind of design project, if not contemporaneous, and certainly built with the same monumentality and design features. And indeed, of course, it ends with this straight line across Buttington to the Sedbury Cliffs, where we have the dramatic views over the Severn. And my point here is that if this is a part of the southern line of Offa's Dyke, its relationship is not simply with the control of the Wye, but about the control and surveillance of the Severn too. So the southern end of Offa's Dyke is surely to be. We need to shift our focus to not thinking about controlling this landscape to its immediate east, but about being able to patrol and control, or at least try to, the territories of the Severn and the Wye in combination. It's controlling as a confluence zone. And this is Sedbury Cliffs in Ormerod's image to give you a sense of how dramatic the dyke would have ended. Now, obviously, erosion has affected these cliffs, and we don't know exactly how it ended, but we have to imagine a watchtower at the very least, and some ability to not simply block land movement on the peninsula here, but to also observe and control the Severn, maybe in overt opposition to the West Saxons. The same can be argued for the north of Wattsdyke, where we have a very interesting landscape, although poorly understood from surviving features. Wattsdyke, which is now on convention, now thought to be later than Offa's Dyke, runs down through a landscape that is now heavily industrialised, such as the Greenfield Valley, to the Dee, at a site of what becomes later the Cistercian Abbey of Basingwork, and at a site that may have been very important, both as a defensive feature and perhaps as a sacred landscape. I've walked this section. I don't know why scholars discount this as the bank of Wattsdyke, although it isn't been convincingly argued for even by Fox, but I think it's as good as many places where it has been argued to be an extant monument. And of course it's very close to the later chapel site of Winifred's Well. Now we have to backtrack many centuries, project many centuries to make that a Mercian or earlier sacred site, but I think it does make the point that this is a key location on the Dee estuary for controlling the movement of along the Dee and along the land routes on its bank, as well as perhaps a site that was elaborated with fortification, the work of Baz's people, the Basing work, whatever that might have been, some kind of fortification long destroyed, perhaps beneath the later Cistercian Abbey site, and perhaps an early holy well, a spring site. So water may have had sacred and military and territorial significances as the dyke drops down into this tight valley as it approaches the River Dee's estuary. The southern end of Wattsdyke is really interesting too, and preliminary fieldwork, not fully published by Margaret Worthington, did make the point that at its southern end, Wattsdyke may have gone far more southerly than Cyril Fox's survey was willing to admit. Cyril Fox took it as far as Maysbury here, south of Oswestry. Margaret Worthington picked up some earthworks that were continuing southwards in this direction as far as Morton Pool, areas that would have been heavy fenland, I would imagine, in the early medieval period, Maysbury Marsh, and there's another St Wilfrid's Well, which may not be entirely coincidental. Mayland and Hayes actually argue that this may be a continuation of Wattsdyke, much further south than is admitted, and CPAT, a Chris Musson aerial photograph, that's Oswestry, this is Maysbury, does show a continuance of a linear feature going over a kilometre further than Wattsdyke is supposed to go. If this is true, and this is tested by future fieldwork as a part of Wattsdyke, we have to extend the possibility that the dykes are not going over just uplands, they are going deep into marshland, perhaps even as canals, facilitating transportation by water from the major river system of the Severn, then overland, defended by it, to the Dee. In other words, these dikes are about connecting up rivers and estuaries and allowing transportation along their eastern side, protected and controlled by their linear earthworks. So the story perhaps isn't about the dike itself, but the invisible land routes and canal systems, portages, points, and seaports that we need to really get some field work and try and find evidence for, that are immediately on their ends and along their eastern sides. My second point. Rivers are operating as dikes in some landscapes. For the D, the 7 and the Y, almost the river becomes part of the landscape monument. This is where what's Offa's Dyke is headed. I'm standing on Offa's Dyke, it's not very monumental here, but imagine there's a huge bank and ditch, perhaps with a palisade on top, who knows, at this point, dropping down to the Y and then sinewing up the other side of around this hill here. And actually, I think it's a bit lost here, but it doesn't matter, you get the idea. So what I'm trying to argue here is that as well as linking rivers, these dikes are also using rivers as part of their defences and western approaches. I cannot imagine a linear earthwork here operating if it wasn't a linear earthwork operating in this landscape if it wasn't also associated with significant tree clearance and the utilisation of the river as part of its line. And at these key lines, we lose the dike, and the river seems to do the job for it at these points. A modest section on the D, the 7 and the Y itself. The D, the smallest, the northernmost area where the river becomes the earthwork, is most intriguing, and that's on the River Dee where it spills out of the Vale of Llangollen, where we have the dike dropping down into the river at Timauer Country Park, as it is now, and hitting a river cliff in a very dramatic location, so that the cliff on the west side provides a defence here. But we lose the dike. It certainly, demonstrably, doesn't continue on the other side, where you can now go and have meet some guinea pigs and stroke llamas and have nice views. It's demonstrably not in that landscape on the northern side, in the country park. But it was thought by Fox, and I think convincingly, to have dropped down using the stream and the tight coombe on the northern side a good 1.5–2 kilometres to the east. So presumably along this line, this steep scarp, some other defensive feature was utilised, but really the river is doing the job on the steep curve around the Dee. And there's the cliffs where that's just a view at that point. We're looking across from the country park to make the point that the dike is hitting these dramatic cliffs and acting as a defensive feature. They continue around. There's the Timor Aqueduct, the railway viaduct. Sorry, beg your pardon. Taking the railway line over. That would be just to orientate you. That's there. Okay. So I'm suggesting that the river is here being utilised effectively as part of the monument. It's also a third point to say that these two earthworks in their northern section, Offa's Dyke and Watts Dyke, use water in very different ways. Now, partly we could argue this is evolutionary, that Watts Dyke is a successor monument and does things better and differently. There are other views to be taken on that, and I don't want to go into that in great detail. All I would say is that Watts Dyke utilises rivers much more effectively as borders than Offa's Dyke. So all of the yellow bits are sections where demonstrably Watts Dyke, which if we take as early 9th century, is therefore a monument built by one of the successors of Offa, perhaps Cenwolf, utilises the steep scarps, the eastern steep scarps of rivers, the Dee, the Ceiriog, and other rivers along large tracts of its line. And therefore it uses rivers, it doesn't simply link rivers, it uses rivers. Whereas Offa's Dyke in this northern stretch, it's struggling, it's valley jumping, and it's not really using rivers very well. Of course, there's a dispute about whether Offa's Dyke is continuing here, but we don't demonstrably have it at present, but word on that is coming soon, I think. A further point is exactly how it responds to rivers, and the dike actually changes orientation at points where it crosses rivers, and is very careful to hit rivers just to the east of confluences. And, let me give you another one. and in some cases to follow carefully along the eastern scarp. So this is Watts Dyke coming down through here. You can see using the rivers as part of its boundary, and likewise at Northock, really following two rivers in its windy course. And again with Allen, Iron Age hill fort here, jumping across the river and then going over to the next valley. And here at Irving, further south, following along the Black Brook, using the watercourse, in this case only a stream, as part of its defensive line. And another possible, it's not exactly plotted properly here, but we may have here the Dee and the Ceiriog, the major confluence of both those major rivers, blocked by the dike. So it's blocking rivers and utilising rivers. And if we compare Watts Dyke and Offa's Dyke in the northern section, we can see that, again, Watts Dyke is being more canny. It's not jumping as many weak points of river valleys as Offa's Dyke. So on average, every 2.6 kilometres, Offa's Dyke is jumping and blocking a river, but Watts Dyke is probably, on average, only blocking a river twice every 5.5 kilometres, partly because it's situated on lower ground further to the east, and partly because it actually seems to be designed more effectively to not have to block as many sort of weak points of valleys. So here it is here's at the Morlus at Draignant, Offa's Dyke, dropping down the valley, blocking off the higher ground and the river flowing down through it. Here down in the Clone Forest, Offa's Dyke, jumping across. The river doesn't look that bright and blue, I've drawn on the photograph just in case you're wondering. And you get the red line is to point out where Offa's Dyke is. Again, it doesn't really have a red line on it. That's my magic of technology that I deploy. But my point is that we can see again and again Offa's Dyke operating very carefully in relation to watercourses. And if you just crudely draw over the OS maps, it allows you to see that relationship quite clearly. The line is not arbitrary, it's carefully managing, as best it can, water sources. And this is the Clywedog, where I told you and showed the picture earlier of Offa's Dyke following along the line of a stream and then blocking at the first point where the stream turns eastward. So yes, Offa's Dyke could have come down and blocked the river at any point here, but it would have done so at a strategic and surveillance disadvantage. So it's done the best job possible to control the river systems to the west and as it moves through the landscape. And here at Ceiriog, this is Chirk Castle, I showed you earlier, the dramatic survival of Offa's Dyke. There's Chirk Castle in the distance, and this is a view from the west. You can see how it comes down, takes a kink, and goes over onto the other side of the valley, controlling the river courses. And I can do this again and again, showing you simplistic, stylised OS map, the red dike, the blue, the rivers, to make the point again and again, just to the east of confluences, adapting itself, doing little kinks and reorientations to control access west-east along these river valleys. And again, and I'll show you lots of this Trevonen. And again, one gets the impression the dike is hardly a grandiose line imposed on this landscape, as some have argued. It is carefully responsive to the local topography and to the rivers. And I don't really need to go through all of these, but this applies to Watts Dyke too, and that's the point I want to make, is that it's not just Offa's Dyke, Watts Dyke is doing the same thing. So here it approaches the Clywedog. It follows the scarp of the Clywedog for half a kilometre, overlooking anyone moving along it, and then jumps across at the narrowest point and up to what becomes a medieval castle. So careful positioning in the landscape to control routes along it and routes across it. Now there's an interesting series of exceptions though that I want to share with you before I wrap up. And that's where the dikes create kind of islands to their east. Now, we don't know exactly the route of the watercourses in the 8th and 9th centuries. This is based on modern lines of the watercourses. But this is a really interesting example because Cyril Fox dug at Frith. It's a Roman station on the Roman road coming southwest out of Chester. So we know this was a Roman settlement and it was a site where Offa's Dyke deliberately traversed through for reasons that we can discuss. From high ground around what is now Mount Zion, down crosses a little stream, and then rather than taking the high ground around here, one could imagine a strategic, logical thing would be to drop down slightly to the east and get across the river, and then take a path around using the river at its frontier, it deliberately decides to jump down here and cut straight in a line across the floodplain. That does a number of things. That allowed the dike to actually cut through a Roman settlement for whatever reason. What I think is interesting, though, is that by doing so, it creates a series of possible, if we take these watercourses as reasonably static in this kind of upland landscape, it's not a sort of lowland sort of scenario where rivers are going to move massively, we're seeing a situation where it's creating natural forts or islands, strongholds. And I think that's quite interesting. So here it's compromising what perhaps would be most strategic in terms of keeping an eye on the landscape and defending the natural topography in order to create these islands created by two rivers heading for a confluence to its east. And it does this a number of interesting times. So I just put some, with the magic of technology, some green blotches there, accurately green blotches. It does this a number of interesting times. So it crosses the Vyrnwy, at least in terms of modern water flow, there's another sort of relatively small area between the line of Offa's Dyke and the confluence of this stream with the Vyrnwy. And of course, where it hits the Severn, it does the same again. So the Neath Brook and various other streams converge just to the west of Offa's Dyke and then flow towards the Severn. Now that may be just a modern feature, this needs further research, but it does create this lowland meadow to its east. What better place, in the summer at least, to have your cattle, to have your horses, to muster your armies, your forces, if you're doing any campaigns westward. That's what I'm thinking. You're creating, at these zones of intersection of rivers, defensible spaces. There's a few others where it crosses the Vale of Montgomery at Brompton Bridge as a smaller example, where the dike deliberately doesn't compromise, it doesn't go here and cut just east of the confluence, it decides just to go straight and allow this small island to be created. And most perhaps prominently at Herrick Hill and Burford Bank, Offa's Dyke creates a number of these to the east on the floodplain as it crosses over in this dramatic sweep up Herrick Hill and onto Rushock Hill. So what I'm suggesting is maybe there's something interesting about the watercourses here. Of course the watercourse might have moved, but can we see the dike incorporating those defensible summer stock enclosures for mustering points, for tribute taking, for campaigning as part of its design? And a further point, is the holy water, is there a sacred dimension to this landscape, or at least a symbolic dimension to this landscape? Is there a deliberate attempt to co-opt and incorporate, as I discussed earlier, St Winifred's Well into the line of the monument? So what am I arguing here? Okay, so I'm not trying to say it's all about water. Offa's Dyke and Watts Dyke are traversing landscape and dividing landscape. They're probably part of complex frontier works, and we shouldn't be too obsessed with them as opposed to all the other things we can less easily see. And yet, we have a sea-to-sea coastal and riverine relationship at their ends. We have evidence that the rivers are operating as part of the dikes, as part of the frontiers, and the Dee, the Severn and the Wye. We do seem to have some evidence it's utilising ravines and valley sides. And Watts Dyke, more than Offa's Dyke, is doing this very effectively. The blocking of rivers is a key strategic aim of both dikes, and Offa's Dyke far more. Were there gates? Were there mills there? Dams, bridges? Were there other features linked to those locations? The control of resources may have been as important as the control of movement at those key nodes. And we also have to think of the possibility there may have been in some locations, I haven't seen this for Watts Dyke yet, where actually hill forts, Iron Age hill forts, may have served a similar role, incorporated at Bryn Allen and at Old Oswestry, but certainly for Offa's Dyke were dyke islands, as marsh forts created by the fact that at certain points the dike cuts across confluences west of the point of confluence, allowing these natural island points to be created. Now, that's just a speculation, but I think it's worth thinking about. And then I'm trying to suggest that maybe this isn't simply about territory and military activities. Maybe there's a symbolic aspect here. The control of riparian identities, the control of these landscapes and their water, and perhaps curtailing or controlling holy waters or existing traditions associated with these landscapes. So, as I said, this is preliminary work, but I think it's about asking new questions of these supposedly familiar and done and dusted monuments, that we can take forward new questions and develop new approaches. Now, I haven't quite finished, because I do want to then take this to a broader context. There are still outstanding questions about the defensive redirections of watercourses. Were they damming for ponding and water power, water mills, causeways, bridges and gates? We don't know anything about this. How was river transport being organised? Were there barge gutters, brined loads? You know, these are features we can't invent, but we should be looking for them. And we would certainly be looking for these if we were looking at ancient or later medieval watery, hydraulic landscapes. So why not at least think about these when looking at these Mercian frontier works? I want to complement this at the end with some broader points about what we're trying to do as part of the collaboratory. Our work isn't a single project. We're trying to encourage anyone and everyone to be participatory and contribute to new work on these supposedly familiar, supposedly well understood, and yet I think still poorly understood monuments. We want to debate Offa's-Dyke and Watts-Dyke as monuments, but also as part of landscapes with life histories. And there are still many new questions to be addressed about these monuments. We want to look at how they're received and perceived in the present day, how they're embellished, how they're interpreted in heritage contexts. And unlike Hadrian's Wall with its UNESCO World Heritage status, Offa's-Dyke doesn't have this. Apparently it was seen as too fragmented and poorly understood to be considered worthy of that status. And I think there is a World Heritage status argument, bid to be made, an argument to make a bid, but I think more broadly, whether that happens or not, this monument traverses, and Watts-Dyke too, which is even more neglected, traverse complex and different landscapes in two different countries, and have many different stories to tell. So far, it's a bit of local folklore and pictures of Offa pointing. There's a lot of pointing does Offa, more than even probably Hadrian does pointing at the work, pointing in the sky, pointing at the Welsh. There's a lot of pointing going on with Offa in the heritage, the visualisation of him, hand on hip usually, while other people dig. But there's not much else. You don't get much of a tangible connection. Local people and tourists don't get a real coherent sense. And there's amazing, I spoke at the Prestatin Walking Festival this summer, and a number of people said, thank you so much for explaining that when I walk on various hill forts in the Clwydians, I'm not on Offa's-Dyke. I didn't know that. I thought I was walking on Offa's-Dyke. No, I'm sorry, you're not. You know, even the line of the path and the dyke, where they don't coincide, that causes a lot of confusion, even for local people who've been walking their dog on a hill fort for 30 years and think they're on Offa's-Dyke. And I'm not saying these people are ignorant. I think that shows a lot about the struggle we have to explain these monuments. They're so big, they always disappear. And so I think that's very difficult to get across. How can such a big monument sort of disappear into people's imaginations, as Margaret and David Hill said in their book from 2003, the long-distance walker almost forgets about the monument. They're just obsessed with doing the walk, the next mile, the next mile. It's very difficult to appreciate the story of this monument, and the same applies to Watts-Dyke, even though there's a Watts-Dyke way. So we've been holding events over the last couple of years, from our inaugural event in Shrewsbury in 2017. This is all gathered there. Events at the Offa's-Dyke Centre in Knighton, and we've got forthcoming events next year as well, at Trevonen and elsewhere. So we're going to, and hopefully an EAA session in Budapest, talking about research on linear earthworks in a European scale. So we've done events, and we continue to do those. We've got a website for the Offa's-Dyke Collaboratory where we've got resources blog posts, a whole range of activities, and you can just join up if you're interested in actively researching the monument. Then you can just become a member for no cost. It's not really a society membership, but it's more just an expression of interest. So email me if you're a researcher wanting to do work that's even vaguely related to Wattsdyke or Offansdyke. But in addition to that, we're actually starting a journal on frontiers and borderlands, digital open access journal. Where I'm trying to apply some of the many lessons I learned from my privilege of editing the RAI's Archaeological journal, but doing so, we're calling it the Offansdyke Journal, not because we want all the papers to be at Offansdyke, but we do want to have a focus, a digital resource where past classics revisited papers can be republished and new work can be presented. So this is edited by me and my doctoral researcher Liam Delaney. We had a first publication deadline last year, and we're just getting together the first issue, and we've got a second volume deadline for May 2020. And it's going to be open access online, and hopefully we'll draw together some other classic papers that perhaps languished it and print-only venues that nobody knows about. So we've got very privileged to have Anne Williams's 2009 paper republished in the first issue, looking at Offansdyke and the historical evidence. And we've got Margaret Worthington Hill's 1997 paper on Wattsdyke is going to be republished with new additional information and material in the first volume of the journal. So hopefully this will ignite students, scholars and the public's interest in the actual scholarly information behind these monuments. And we hope to build new projects, looking at the monument and new networks and community engagement projects, new fieldwork projects. We're supporting Clwyd Powys Archaeological Trust in their work, and new landscape analyses. And as part of the landscape analysis, my doctoral researcher Liam Delaney is doing a lot of work, and this is his work, not mine, on the LiDAR evidence for Offansdyke. So this is just a visualisation following Offansdyke through a bit of the Vale of Montgomery, I think it is. And he's already, I don't want to speak for him, but I will, he's already found Offansdyke in about 7 locations where it's not supposed to be, which leads massive questions about the conservation of a monument. We still don't even know where it goes. How do we conserve a monument where we're presuming we're writing out its existence over many miles when we actually can find it on the ground? And it also asks questions about, well, how are we going to do research if we're only looking at the bits where the banks and ditches survive? So I'm afraid this is more of a watch this space paper, but I hope it's at least engaged you with these monuments that are so often seen as familiar or insurmountable. We can't learn more. There's new work ongoing, new excavations, new field work, and we do hope in coming years to be able to re-energise a whole series of community projects and academic projects to tackle the monuments in new ways. And I hope my hydraulic approach is perhaps one humble way in which we can look at these monuments afresh. So thank you very much.